Like you, I don't remember everything.
Responsible Mae Brussell is. And this is World Watchers program on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's Mae Brussell, and this is broadcast number 633. I'm getting the numbers off since the first of the year, January 23rd, 1984. As a matter of fact, for those of you that subscribe to the broadcast, I put December 16th on that last week instead of January. I think I want to hold that last year back. I'm really having trouble with 1984, so the sheet that goes with your broadcast on page 2, it's correct, it's January, but on the page 1 with the bibliography of information, I put December 16th, so change that in case you haven't already. Now, we usually begin with a resume of what we were talking about just a year ago this evening to see how fast the year goes and what was in the news at that time. That year ago this evening was broadcast number 581, January 24th, 1983, and I was talking about the Bulgarian connections, the influence of disinformation to shape our opinion of who shot the Pope in the Vatican Square there, and the connection, of course, Mehmet Aja was blamed. Originally, he confessed to the crime. He had a history with Nazis, with the werewolves, with the far right wing in Lebanon, the training camps, and with the Frankfurt, Germany, and around the world in Turkey. He had killed a publisher in Turkey, a leftist publisher, and was released from the jail to go about and do what he did best, which is another assassination attempt, which, if he had connections to the KGB or Bulgarian, would have been an excuse for an act of war. And on that program, I did a lot about the disinformation of Aja and who was pushing it out. Michael Ledeen, the Minister of Propaganda, I was talking about his links to Alexander Haig and Licio Gelli of the Masonic P2, the Italian fascists, and Henry Kissinger, Opus Dei, and the links of Michael Ledeen to this disinformation, and Claire Sterling, the writer who continuously pushes her ideas that are pure theory and BS. About half of the things she writes about their propaganda made out, they're really, a lot of it outright lies. Well, this year there was an article just recently, I quoted, in fact, last week, talking about the Knights of Malta from the National Catholic Reporter, October 14th, 1983, a few months ago. Who are the Knights of Malta? And in that article, it describes 2 members of Congress who are knighted by the Vatican with that dual loyalty. One is Senator Jeremiah Denton, the Democrat from Georgia, from Larry McDonald's home area, and Peter Dominici, the Democrat from New Mexico. And they carry on, according to Mr. Lee, the nightly crusade as part of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Internal Security. And one of the people they work with is Claire Sterling, who I was talking about just almost a year earlier. And they mentioned that she was convicted of a libel suit in a French court accusing someone of being a KGB agent, and that person wasn't. And that a lot of the information for USIA, U.S. Information Service, that was taken over by Mr. Zwick, his real name is Z-W-I-C-K, not Wick, is disinformation and propaganda to hurry along that war against the Soviet Union. Also, just a year ago, I was, in conjunction with the Vatican scandals and stories, I was talking about Alex Cockburn of the Village Voice. For the second time, he felt that he had to write about Mae Brussell, or put down a Mae Brussell, because of the article I did on Grace Kelly's links to the Vatican and Licio Gelli, and how she could be privy to information and be killed at the time she was because of what she knew going back and forth to the Vatican as a bagwoman between the mafia and the Monte Carlo, the gaming tables in the Vatican, and her politics with American intelligence. She is sort of the queen bee and courier for all these different factors. So Alex Coburn was putting me down in the Village Voice, and just a year later, January the 13th, 1984, Coburn has been suspended from the Village Voice for having received money, a $10,000 grant from a pro-Arab organization from the Middle East. And New York Times says, critic of Israel on The Voice got an Arab Institute grant. The funny thing is that if Alex Coburn knew how anti-Semitic I was, he'd probably be on my side. He probably thinks that because I'm a Jew, I approve of a lot of the things going on. I don't, and I quote him very often. His articles against Begin and the brown shirts and the way Israel behaves certainly deserves criticism. As a matter of fact, I actually felt sorry for him if he weren't so mean to me and Bob Fass. He got us off the air on WBAI when we got close to Nazi connections of what was going on in the world. I felt sorry for him for being fired because that $10,000 grant was to write a book about the Lebanon invasion, and I certainly think there are things about that in the role of Israel playing the games with the Phalange, the Nazi family, the Jamals, and the Israeli government certainly should be exposed for what it is. The Institute of Arab Studies gave him the money to write the book. I'm sorry he was fired because I think we need the book, and I don't like to see that kind of censorship, and I think you need some voice attacking the policies of Israel. They're so holy, and the non-Jewish politicians get their votes, and Jean Kirkpatrick and Alexander Haig portray themselves as the great pro-Israelis, as does Helene von Damme, while they knife them in the back as Nazis and encourage their behavior, which gets the attention of the rest of the world. We fund them and send these weapons, and they do these massacres. So in a way, I don't appreciate his taking pot shots at me, but it's pretty nice all the way from New York City out to this station in Carmel for what I do that he has to find it necessary. And the Village Voice even mentioned Mae Brussell. But I feel sorry that he was fired because I think what he was doing is necessary, and who's going to put up the money for it? Not the B'nai B'rith of the Anti-Defamation League. And I wish they'd give him $10,000 more to investigate Simon Wiesenthal, who's a big fraud if he ever came down the pike, or a few other people that pretend to take care of Jewish interests but serve the anti-Semites really better. I did mention last week, just before World Watchers started, but forgot to put on this broadcast, there's a series on public broadcasting. Most of you get it in the big cities. Out here it's called public broadcasting, but the plays and series that you get are similar. I don't know what it's called in New York, but there's a 12-part series on Riley, the ace of spies. Described this week's issue is working undercover in Manchuria. Riley follows British instructions to aid the Japanese Navy to plan to attack the Russian fleet. This is a 12-part series. The first part was excellent, and the second part this week, Thursday, out here, but you'll get it back east maybe the same nights, or it may start in a week or two later. But be sure to see the series on Riley, the master spy. It begins the last week with Zaroff, Sir Basil Zaroff, a man who makes and distributed weapons all over the world, who had his headquarters in Monte Carlo, trying to rearm the monarchies to take back Mother Russia. And then following Zaroff, Samuel Cummings set up his headquarters in Monte Carlo and in London to continue with people like the Radziwill families and the monarchies from all over the world to get them back on their throne. A combination of Nazis, Vatican, and monarchy working to make war against the Soviet Union to, as I say, get back their territory. So this was a program that just started out here this week, but look in your TV guide on that Riley and see what you can find and see if it's in your city. Ronald Reagan this week on Thursday will be announcing his plans to run for president. On our broadcast out here on the West Coast on NBC, his announcement will follow a movie called World War III. That's very interesting because the same week that he's announcing his presidency, that will follow NBC 5 minutes off of World War III so that you can hear Ronald Reagan say he's running for president. The Washington Post had a long story last week how the Pentagon plans to win World War IV. Now, I've cut out several articles and statistics about how many million or billion will die, and they're really serious. They're going to put submarines beneath ice caps, the Arctic cap, for the duration of World War III, and they're planning this. It's all in the drawing boards, just like Mein Kampf, as I mentioned earlier, before this program started, on the other program. It's all there for reading if you want to. So the president will make his announcement at 10:55 out here following World War III, and he's already planning at the Pentagon where the top people who run the government will go until World War IV comes along. Now, I'm going into, in a few minutes, into William French Smith and Edwin Meese, but before I do that and take what they're doing in Los Angeles and Los Angeles Police Department and the stories that are tangled to that, there is something that was in the newspaper last week, and the San Francisco Chronicle today, and the Washington Post January 13th, and our papers out here carried it. It's a two-part article by Jack Anderson. The death squads have permeated Latin America. Now, what's important about this is that Jack Anderson is updating something that he has done on and off for the past 2 years, but is pertinent to exactly what I was writing about in the Rebel, the November 22nd Rebel. If you don't have those, I'll send you information, and I have reprinted it because it's not on the newsstand any longer. Jack Anderson says this, and it is pertinent to how these assassination teams were formed and exactly what I was writing about, and he brings it up to today's death squads. He said, operating out of the Latin American politics is a far-flung network of death squads. It starts in Latin America, he said, and now goes around the world. The purpose is to intimidate suspected leftists and deter movements that threaten the status quo. That is exactly what I've said, and the death squads are in this country and have been going on by the thousands for the last 20, 30 years, but it's taking a long time before people will be able to realize how it permeated. He said they intimidate a suspected leftist. They decide, these people in power have decided what the status quo is, and that goes back to Zaharoff and Riley and Samuel Cummings and the Vatican and the Nazi group. He said their method includes kidnapping, assassinations, secret pacts, intrigue, terrorism, and blackmail. All of that. These bombings, kidnappings, the tunnels, the homes, the individuals, all of that is part of it. What is appalling, Jack Anderson writes, is the idea that the anti-communist, in quotes, Murder Incorporated, germinated at the Central Intelligence Agency. See, that is what happens when you have the Kissingers working with the Klaus Barbies and the Fritz Kramers into the Pentagon. You take it one step further. He says sources familiar with the secret history of the squad said they were formed under the agency sponsorship in 1954. Now, the agency started sponsoring in 1954. What I wrote in the Rebel was that the death teams started in 1950 and worked up when Nicola Malaxi was washed out through Nixon's office and down to Argentina, and Otto Skorzeny goes up to Spain. And I detailed the years 1950 as being when the teams began to be formed and the financing with the death of Evita Peron, but they were operational after 54. Jack Anderson says whatever their origin, and I'm telling you their origin, whatever, he leaves that open, the death squads got out of control. Dedicated to the elimination of suspected leftists, they recruited assassins from the military, the police, and the security agencies. Now that's where we go in a minute to the Los Angeles Police Department, where the Secret Service, the security agents, and the LAPD, along with the military, were forming Squad 19 and their death squads that they've had up and down this state since Reagan was governor. He said today the death squads are most active in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Dormant death squads exist in every other Latin American nation. In all these countries, the squads are protected by the military and the government. And he describes a man who he talked to who described one organization. It's called the White Hand, La Mano Blanco. Remember Jonestown, the White Knight, the White Dragon. I've talked about the fellow that Frazier said was at the back of he sent a note to the Judge Franken at the time of his trial. He was charged with killing the Oda family, and he mentioned the name of a famous entertainer, and I've told you personally, I haven't been on the air, many of you know who it is, a well-known famous entertainer whose son belonged to the International White Army, the International White Dragon. He was part of this Murder Incorporated that was playing a part in the Manson family. They have different names, the White Hand, they use the White Hand, the White Force, the White Brigade. They are part of a team, CAL are the letters here, Latin American Anti-Communist Confederation, but CAL is really the Latin American affiliate of the World Anti-Communist League. That is what I wrote about Colonel Charles Willoughby, working with Douglas MacArthur and coming from Franco and Heidelberg, Germany. This is exactly what I was writing about in The Rebel. The World Anti-Communist League, Jack Anderson, says is a right-wing organization linked to ultra-conservative groups in Asia, Europe, and the United States. See, Robert Mayu of the Youth Organization, and they're using people like John Rosselli and Sam Giancana. That is the World Anti-Communist League. Guy Bannister was in the FBI with Mayu in Chicago. Guy Bannister had that office on Camp Street that backed up to Lee Harvey Oswald and went down to Asia and the Caribbean for the World Anti-Communist League. And, of course, then he goes on and describes a fellow with a pseudonym, El Lobo, who told him about the Honduran death squad in 1979. It used to have 85 members, and now we have 400. Remember how I've said that in Honduras, Joseph Mengele was seen there by somebody who told me about it. That's how I got those FBI papers, and Simon Wiesenthal and Mr. Mendelsohn in Washington, and all the other people cover up the fact that those were the headquarters in Honduras for Joseph Mengele and the Nazi World Anti-Communist League that was going on. And I haven't gotten one Jew or one person in the State Department to admit to that fact of how the Hondurans got set up. That's how it got set from Martin Bormann to Joseph Mengele to the Honduras. So where they had 85 people, they now have 400. They said they have successfully infiltrated every organization. Now they're at the universities and labor unions. That's why so many professors, so many newspaper writers, and so many labor people are killed all over the world. They bragged about eliminating 16 people so far in Honduras labor unions and university professors, but they've done more. They kidnap the victim, they write anonymous letters, and they send messages. Men don't fight with flowers, they fight with bullets. And it tells about gunning one person down, just putting him in the trunk of a car and blowing his head off. One person that checked into a hotel that they didn't like. Now that was the part one of the assassination article that Jack Anderson did. Today, January 23rd, he has another one, part two, the front for the assassins. He said, I've been investigating the Latin American death squads that practice politics by assassination, the network of right-wing groups that cooperate across international boundaries. That goes to Rome, to Licio Gelli, to France, to the bombings, to the Middle East, to the United States, to the Minutemen, to the Nazis, and he's now saying that that network spread all over the world. The death squad, a member of it in Honduras, is a physician. By day, he's an efficient physician, and at night, he kills. And that's, I don't want to digress on this, I'll do more later, on the medical school in Granada, and the team of assassins that work around those doctors, Mr. Jeffrey Bourne and Mr. Peter Bourne. Who in the heck are they? Where did they come from? And I'm going to be doing a lot more on their training in England and the connections of the Tavistock Clinic to the Nazi death squads that go back to the 30s, long before even Hitler. There were plans for eugenics and getting rid of particularly black people and Jews. Jack Anderson writes about this ultra-conservative link with the worldwide organization founded in Taiwan. He has the date 1967. It began a long time before Taiwan. And that's why it's important that Madame Chennault is on the board of 20th Century Fox with Henry Kissinger and William Rogers and Gerald Ford and that gang, going back to the World Anti-Communist League, back to Taiwan, and the forming of Reverend Moon with Nazi money between the Mafia and the Nazis. He says that this group in recent years, they have been including known Nazi white supremacist groups. He calls them neo-Nazi. There isn't a thing neo unless they were born in the last 20 years. But the hardcore Nazis, the Bormanns, the Mengeles, and the Barbies have been very much alive. Barbie was just arrested last February. Each country's underground death squad has an acknowledged front group that gives legitimacy to it. It's an anti-communist movement, or they'll call themselves the Action Movement. They say they're anti-communist. They're actually the front for the death squads, and they get their training and their weapons from the police departments and the military in these countries. And the Escuadron de la Muerte, the Squadron of Death, goes and kills common criminals, but it also kills communists or leftists. Jack Anderson has a long story, as I say in the paper just today, on part 2, World Anti-Communist League. And so that is an admission of a part getting one step further. All he has to do is to get the Guy Bannister and that gang down in New Orleans and the people that I wrote about in my article to the point of putting this together, and he will know the origin of these teams. Now, some of you could copy the article I did on JFK and the Nazis and spread that around. A listener in Houston, Texas, made 120 copies of the Hustler article on the Los Angeles Police Department and Western Goals. She sent me a list of about 40 or different 50 people. She didn't write 120 congressmen, people that she's active in the Democratic Party in Houston, relatives, and different people around the country. She is sending this out. She has already sent 120 copies. How many of you have sent copies to any public officials, publications on just the Larry McDonald Western Goals? You know, the Congressman Leon Panetta was out here seeing constituents last week before he went back, and a listener went to see him and talked about Larry McDonald and Western Goals, and he never heard of Western Goals. Well, it's no wonder, but there is a way to get information to these people, and she said she would supply him. Now, there are two big stories, the two most important stories really that I consider of the last months. They're important for the meaning of what's behind them and who's participating, and they're also important for the total news blackout on these two things. One is the invasion of Grenada and what happened there, and the other is the Western Goals links to the Los Angeles Police Department and the suit of the American Civil Liberties Union against the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, out of all of this, on the printed sheet that I have that goes with this broadcast, I listed the winners of these activities. Number one is Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, future Attorney General of the United States. He is one of the winners. He gets this promotion, and I'll go into the reasons why. Another winner is Lord Peter Carrington, who now moves to become head of NATO, who set up headquarters in Barbados as early as 1980 to help overthrow the government and get rid of Maurice Bishop. Another winner is Henry Kissinger, who was brought in by William Clark in July of this year, 1 month after Maurice Bishop went to see him and wanted to get along with the United States. And Henry Kissinger was put in charge of the Central America future bloodbath, co-partner with Lord Carrington. As his reward, he will become the next Secretary of State, and if there's a constitutional convention, he'll become President of the United States. Another winner of all this is Sir Eric Gary, the deposed dictator from Grenada, who's on his way back. And the fifth winner of all this is Alexander Haig, who just got put on the board of Amway. And I'll do a lot on Amway Corporation and their holdings in South Africa and the fascist setup that it is, and then on the board of MGM. So between the two, he can travel between NATO, the Vatican, and the Nazis, be an international bagman. Now, who were the losers out of all this? Those were the winners in the last month, just over the Christmas-January season. The losers, number one, Larry Flynt, because he had the courage to publish the only national article in the United States on Western Goals, Los Angeles Police Department, and Larry McDonald. And he's the only person in the United States with the guts to publish the article on Murder Incorporated, the CIA Nazi death squads that Jack Anderson is writing about now, and the only publisher in the United States to write about Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, Alfred Bloomingdale, the mafia, sex, violence, murder, counterintelligence. Larry Flynt did all that. In his recent articles in Rebel, he has Vicki Morgan's story of Don Freed and Bill Turner and their interconnections that I'm going to in a minute. And he did cover the story of the LAPD that was not meant to be covered, and in return, the whole team of the Defense Department moved in and took over that place, he and his wife. And I'm sure when he comes out of all this, he's beginning to see some of the things that happened. I talked with somebody today, and Larry Flynt is beginning to understand, and I don't want to take liberty to tell you where he's seeing the light, but he's a very bright man. And if he was chemically drugged and made to look crazy and suicidal or to give away his money and act nuts, those chemistries can be altered with medication. And if the medication is right, he will be back where he was. And when he gets back there, he will remember everything that happened to him, because that is the clinical route that this stuff takes, and his mind will come back. He was a loser because of what's happened to him for the time he took on these articles. The Free Press is a loser. The Free Press that was not able to go into Grenada for 5 days, could not cover the El Salvador massacres a few weeks ago, where there's every indication that poison gases were used in both places. The Chicago Sun is a loser. I heard Mike Royko talking with Phil Donahue, and I have to send for the transcript. Royko tells how David Murdoch came into Chicago and plunked down $90 million cash in 1.5 hours and bought the Chicago Sun because Ronald Reagan doesn't want any more Edwin Meese or Grenada talk. And on December the 16th, Edwin Meese was talking about no poor people in this country, no starving people. All you do is get David Murdoch, who owns the London Times, who has to work with Lord Peter Carrington, the new head of NATO. Murdoch's from Australia, and plunk in Carrington and Kissinger for the sake of Ronald Reagan, can plunk in $90 million, and in return, Henry Kissinger becomes the star of the Washington Post and articles in the New York Times. His ugly face is on every single newspaper. That was a payoff. The Vicki Morgan Act was a payoff, and this is a payoff. Henry Kissinger's star will rise because the newspapers that criticize this administration will be bought up. Kissinger and Carrington have some clients, and Henry Gonzalez better check out David Murdoch, besides whole countries, which they say they don't have. And Maurice Bishop, of course, was a loser because he deposed a CIA Nazi dictator who works with Papa Doc and the Korean CIA and Mr. Pinochet in Chile and every dictator in Central America. So Maurice Bishop exposed Mr. Gary. Bishop was trying to tell about Eric Gary. He knew him. His father was killed by him. He was beaten up by him. So Bishop was killed, and Gary is on the way back. Those are the winners and losers of this particular scene based upon the newspaper articles that I have. Gary had the nerve to say, Sir Eric Gary, it was in the New York Times this week, that he's coming back and he's the last elected government and they've got to treat me as a statesman. This is a guy who was bringing in coffins from Chile so the medical school could use them for God knows what or how many. And the medical school was right on the airport, and I'll be writing a lot about that. Sir Eric Gary wants the United States present there. He wants a Cuban airport to be called the Ronald Reagan International Airport. He says he will direct the people who run the government. He will be a consultant. I'm going to be a consultant. And he wants a military escort. He says as a sign of respect from the airport, the United States troops should escort him for his great return, and he will be the consultant behind anyone in power. He says there will be scarcely anyone in the Caribbean with my political expertise. And he said, I'm not a weak character and I'm not afraid of anything or anybody. And also the article about Haig and Amway, that was January 23rd. I'll do more on Alexander Haig and the Amway Corporation in a while to come. Now, when I'm going to do a little chronology here on what happened to Edwin Meese and William French Smith and the way the turnover took place with William French Smith running home to California real fast. There was a reason he's running fast, and I'll get into that with you in about 2 minutes. Incidentally, Rebel has a long article, as I say, with a picture of the new Attorney General, Edwin Meese, and a description of him as the top advisor, calling in Marvin Mitchelson to the White House for a private dinner for the sole purpose of telling him not to let the Vicki Morgan tapes out. And, of course, they all obeyed, and Vicki got her head cracked, and Edwin Meese is the one who called Vicki's attorney and protects the president. He's the Batman to protect the president. Also around Larry Flynn, incidentally, is Madeleine Hare. I just met her one time. One time I was at Larry's house. Insulting, rude woman. She has an article in the paper this week. She doesn't think it matters if there's an envoy to the Vatican. She told me Galen wasn't important, that her husband worked for him. The first husband worked for him, that he was a hitman. He literally did killings, she suggested. And for the FBI, her first husband worked for Reinhard Galen. And she came up to me and practically attacked me. I don't like anything you do and anything you say. So now, when they asked her about the envoy of the Vatican, she said she thinks that's fine. Why would it bother her? Madeleine Murray O'Hare is Madeleine Murray, and you have to almost see her to believe her. She's the best argument for going to church that's come down the pike. And I read an article this week that Larry Flynn's turning back to God. After a few weeks with Madeleine Murray, I would too. Now we'll take a 1-minute break and then continue this on the next side. Now we'll begin side 2 of World Watchers. This is broadcast number 633, January 23rd, 1984, Mae Brussell on KAZU in Pacific Grove, California. Larry Flynt had courage, as I said before. He published certain things that nobody else has dared to tell. There's a lawsuit going on in Los Angeles. It's been working up for 5 years, and it was just ready to go to court in the first of the year. And I'm going to do the chronology of this case right up to William French Smith and Mr. Edwin Meese taking over. The chronology goes like this. The San Jose Mercury had a story January the 7th, 1984. San Jose Peace Center list is in the Los Angeles police files, and this article is about Jerome Ducote, who made 17 break-ins in 1976 and went to the San Jose Peace Center and took their list of membership and who gave them money. And he's a member of the Birch Society and the Young Republicans, and he turned it over to a part of the Los Angeles Police Department that went directly into the police files. And after their theft, the woman in charge of the Peace Center said that they got threatening letters from the right-wing Kansas-based group calling itself the Minutemen. This goes back in 1976, and I got a letter from the Minutemen, and I have remembered those pictures with the scope. In fact, I stopped getting milk delivery at the house because they said they would put poison in the milk, and so from then I would buy it at the market. Got a letter about poison in the milk. This woman at the police center said, a message said, "You are in the crosshair of my gun, you traitor." That's what we got from these kinds of people. Jerry Ducote and his list ended up at the Los Angeles Police Department. It was supposed to go to a fireman's fund, a fire and police intelligence organization of Los Angeles, which kept tabs on leftists, which translated is the Evel Younger, Ed Davis, Daryl Gates, LAPD files. Now that story broke January the 7th, that Ducote's information was in the Los Angeles Police Department. Now in January, it was dated February, magazines are post-dated. Actually, it came out in the stands January the 1st, was the Hustler article on the Korean Airlines and Larry McDonald with Larry Flynt's name on that, which refers to Mr. Ducote, whose material was later in the police department. In this article, it says, key backers, financiers, and appointees of Ronald Reagan have always been involved with police spying and worse. And of course, you know, I helped Larry with this article. Those of you who know me know the history of this story. I wrote that the trail leading to the connection between Reagan and McDonald is long and winding. Larry McDonald to Ronald Reagan, the present president of the United States who wants to run for president again. And I went into the burglaries that took place of Jerry Ducote, whose name appeared, and how he helped Ronald Reagan when he was governor. Ducote was a former sheriff's deputy employed by Ronald Reagan's backers. And I had a quotation of Warren Hinkle, who said a few years ago, "What is happening in Santa Clara County today is the germ of the biggest scandal of the next 1.5 years." Okay, the germ may stop with William French Smith on the West Coast, and I'll go into it. And I wrote about the links of John Reese of Western Goals to Jerry Ducote, and this was published in Hustler, the relationship of this spy in the Hustler magazine dated February that was on the stands in January. It has a full page on the Los Angeles Police Department, in fact, 3 pages on Jerry Ducote, working for Ronald Reagan, working for the John Birch Society, working for John Reese, who goes to form Western Goals, and mentioning that Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, the attorney for the Los Angeles Police Department, is the law office of Attorney General William French Smith, and they're also the attorney for Ronald Reagan, his personal law office. Now, 1 month later in Rebel, January 23rd, one article was in the San Jose Mercury, another in Hustler. Then Larry Flynt had Don Freed and Bill Turner write, and Don Freed wrote about Bloomingdale. He said Bloomingdale became a Reagan spy master during the first year of the governor's power in 1966. It was Bloomingdale who was involved in the campaign to smash Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Union. This campaign involved break-ins, burglaries, beatings, and at least one assassination plot. See, I'd been on the air since 1971, and this was in 1976, and those past broadcasts detail all of this. And Larry Shears was the guy hired to kill Eldridge Cleaver and Cesar Chavez, and I have tape recordings in my home and transcripts of the discussion with the IRS Internal Revenue, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and that's where John Caulfield, who worked also with Peter Bourne in the White House in those days, in the drug department, and this was really Murder Incorporated inside the White House. They were planning to kill Chavez, and Don Freed writes about working with Bloomingdale in Reagan's master plan to stifle the dissent of students out here and minorities was none other than Edwin Meese III, who turns up years later on the famous Vicki Morgan sex tapes. John Reese of Western Golds worked with Jerry Ducote. Ducote works with Alfred Bloomingdale and Ronald Reagan, and Edwin Meese was the guy hiring them and working with them to break students, break minorities, our future Attorney General. Those were 3 articles, 2 published by Larry Flint in January of this year, and 1, the Ducote story, breaking from there. Now, what happens in this month that all of this broke? Okay, January the 7th was the story of the Peace Center and Jerome Ducote in the San Jose Mercury. January the 9th, 2 days later, the San Jose Mercury had an article asking for money for the American Civil Liberties Union. They were seeking donations. They said they may have to take out a second mortgage on their office. They needed $313,000. They said, in quotes, "This is ACLU's most extraordinary moment in history." Imagine going 5 years getting this trial ready, 131 plaintiffs illegally spied upon when the material was supposed to have been destroyed, and they're asking for money, and I was going to help raise some money and try to see what we could do. They said their 5-year-old suit is now defunct. They need money desperately to carry on, and that they were sending out these letters. And on January the 9th, that they mentioned also they discovered today the microfilm of the Peace Center in San Jose. That's the Jerry Ducote story. And then they went back that the pretrial cost them over $700,000, and Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, William French Smith's office, had been paid $1.3 million by the city of L.A. That was 2 days after the Ducote story broke, and the Larry Flint stories in Rebel and in Hustler were out on the stands. One was soon to come out with Edwin Meese's picture, and the other one was out with the links to Ronald Reagan of Ducote to the LAPD trial. January the 11th, 2 days later, after Ducote was revealed, the state Supreme Court was hearing a plea by the Los Angeles Police Department not to identify a certain informer that was still working for the police department. And the ACLU says we need to know that informer. Protection should not be given to informers who spy on people who have not committed crimes. And they pointed out the difference that an informer, if you are breaking a case of a drug dealer or a murderer, you don't give out the name of the informer if you're about to arrest. But if you're informing on law-abiding citizens who never committed a crime, there's only one thing it could be, which is an agent provocateur, setting them up and then arresting them or planting evidence on them to arrest them and charge them, whether it's burglary or murder or whatever. So the Civil Liberties Union said if we're not entitled to get the informer's identity, the whole avenue of investigation is foreclosed to us. Now, January the 11th in the LA Times was side by side with another story. There's new effort to settle the police suit that they've been trying since December to never go to court. They've carried this since January a year ago. It's been in the newspapers down there almost every single day. Newsweek, as I mentioned before, had a one little story never mentioning Western Gold. So it's a year later. It was in May of last year that they linked to Western Gold and Larry McDonald and the Birch Society and the Galen operation, the VND, and the Vienna offices and the German offices. January the 11th in the Los Angeles Times, new effort to settle the police. They wanted to close it. Now, the Civil Liberties Union was going to go along with closing the case for this reason. They said they rejected the settlement last month, but they would take it if the LAPD would agree in the future to have a watchdog to watch their policies for spying. We'll take a settlement of $1.5 million now for what you did in the past if you will have a watchdog. And they emphasize that the anti-terrorist division which is in charge of the Olympic Games and is the same police department that changed its name when the other was caught with these files going into the $100,000 computer. They wanted a watchdog on the anti-terrorist division. The ACLU wanted it settled out of court in December, but they said if it went to trial, they would do it. But they felt if they went to trial, there would be fewer restrictions that they could put on the police department. They may win the case, but case closed. If they set their terms that we want a settlement, that you will have people overseeing your counterintelligence and your terror division, we will settle it out of court. 3 days later, January the 14th, Los Angeles Herald, new optimism on the city council settlement of the suit. Mayor Tom Bradley, who is a member of the Los Angeles Police Department, has been working night and day. He doesn't want these police cases open. And what's in these files are the 8 years that Ronald Reagan was governor of California. L.A. Chief Darrell Gates, who is a former Marine, who now took over Ed Davis's job, objects strenuously to any outside oversight of his department. So the Civil Liberties Union says, we'll settle if you have a watchdog and make sure you're not doing this again on us law-abiding citizens. And Gates, the police chief, says, no, we want to settle with no strings attached. 1 day later, January the 15th, Los Angeles Times, police spying case is settled. And that was also in the San Jose Mercury, the case is settled. Well, you'd think it was all over. The city council agreed in principle that they would settle the case, but they were infuriated. A Joel Wachs, W-A-C-H-S, of the city council, was furious that the terms of the meeting leaked, that they decided they would make a settlement and the Civil Liberties Union would take $200,000 less, but to release the details of the meeting, they said jeopardized the city's position because they were bargaining about the city position, and what they wanted is that they wanted to clear, the city of LA wants the agreement, we'll pay you $1.5 million and say that the police were not guilty. Don't let a judge hear any of the evidence collected 5 years, 131 plaintiffs or individuals, just say nobody is guilty. That's what the council wanted to say. So January the 15th in the LA Herald, it says city council believes this is what they want to say on spying, that, in quotes, most of the city police officers accused of illegal spying are innocent of wrongdoing. We will pay you, but the police are innocent. Most of them. Well, if there's 47 defendants and 2 more took this material home to the garage to send to Edward Teller and Admiral Moore and Roy Cohn and Murder Incorporated, because the reason I started the program with the Murder Incorporated that is in the paper today and in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago of Jack Anderson is these pieces of information went into the computer of Murder Incorporated, of Jeremiah Denton in Georgia, Larry McDonald in Georgia, Roy Cohn of the Mafia, Admiral Moore with Kissinger and Kramer and the network of Yeoman Redford, and they're stealing from Richard Nixon for the Pentagon, and he became Joint Chief of Staff, and Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, and Mr. Steinholtz, a flyer for the Luftwaffe, a Nazi on the board. They want a deal that says most were innocent, not about Western girls, not about taking it home. Nobody's to be prosecuted. Case is closed. You're not supposed to know about the garage or Mary Love, his wife, who got $30,000 to stuff their darn computer and who's still stuffing it, illegally keeping papers that were to be destroyed in 1975, sending them back east into Europe, in Vienna, to Helene von Dahm in Vienna, and in Germany, the Galen Group. Nothing about that. Most of them, if you have 2 that send all the files of everybody in California or every major city of the United States to those people, you have trouble. Murder Incorporated has enough people to drop off labor leaders, professors, leftists for years to come and to blacklist them from jobs. So January the 15th, the LA Herald says that the city council, as part of the deal, will make a statement that most that were accused are innocent. Now, the ACLU said they'd have to ask their plaintiffs if they wanted to accept this offer, because to admit that publicly says that it believes most did not engage in crimes, and they want to go to court. They should meet them head on. And Joel Wachs again said that the leak the leak of the settlement of the terms of it is so serious, this is a quote from the L.A. Herald, is so serious that if this city were a private corporation, heads would roll in the morning. And the logic is that the city council felt that it would be cheaper to make a settlement. This is their logic, that it would cost between $3 and $5 million to Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Well, why would Ronald Reagan's law office or William French Smith's office turn down an extra $2 million or $3 million from the city council? If the police are innocent, that's an easy $3 million to make, and the city would pay for it. But the logic is that we don't want L.A. to spend $3 million. So then there was another quotation in the article. The council would say, again, that in no way did any substantial violation of property by PDID officers, that the overwhelming activity were not only proper but commendable. Now that's exactly when Lee Harvey Oswald took the lie detector test in Dallas with the FBI, and he said, "Are you going to ask me if I'm a law-abiding citizen?" And they said, "Yeah," and he passed that. "Am I a God-fearing, law-abiding? Am I a patriotic, law-abiding?" And he adds all this stuff, and he passes it, of course. I forget the exact words, but the idea is that they said in no way did any substantial violation, of those officers, and that the overwhelming were not only proper, but they were commendable. 47 defendants from the police department and 2 more that took this stuff to their private garages and papers. Now, January the 16th, the Los Angeles Herald began a probe, not of Westergold's, not the garage, but who leaked the papers. Not the fact that the papers should have been destroyed, not the fact that they were taken home, that they go overseas, that they go to Larry McDonald, whose contacts with George Habash had the violence for the Munich Olympic Games. No, they began to go into this again, and they stated again, the city council tentatively has agreed to issue an announcement that the majority of the city's officers accused of illegal spying on activist groups or individuals are innocent of wrongdoing. The city council says, look, we've spent $1.5 million, they spent $700,000. We will be the judge, we will be the jury, and tell you they didn't do any wrongdoing. Why can't they go to trial? That's the question. When does the city council stop the trial and then proclaim the innocence, the fact that they're paying $1.5 million? Why don't they go to court and prove the $1.5 million? Okay, so the city council gets concerned that the plaintiffs will reject their offer by the 16th. There's an article in the Herald, the council's concerned now that the 131 plaintiffs will reject their offer because it might strengthen the American Civil Liberties Union's resolve to prove the officers are guilty. If they're paying them $1.5 million and they're saying nobody is guilty, if I were one of those 131 plaintiffs, I would demand that it go to court. That they're proclaiming the innocence of everybody like a total dictator. This is like Nazi Germany, the French courts, the Dutch courts, the German courts. Our police are innocent, period. And the police are let off. Why are they willing to do that? So by January the 17th, both sides are requesting a delay in the suit to think it over. Both lawyers on both sides, it was only agreed by the city council that both will agree. So then they said, they mentioned Willard Carr, the spokesman for Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, the law firm defending the case, was silent on the delay, and they both decided they'd delay. In the paper it said a key provision in the ACLU's earlier settlement demanding a retired judge be appointed to oversee the undercover operations was phased out of the latest version. The city council wants to close the case without an oversight of a police commission or a judge to watch the anti-terrorist PDID group, the police department group, the police intelligence. The original reason for settling, for talking about settling, is that they get agreement that they couldn't pull provocateurs and hanky-pankies. So after the city council gets an agreement that they're just about ready to sign, they pull out the condition that their people will be oversighted by anybody, that they can do what they want, and furthermore that everyone or most of them were innocent and exemplary behavior. That's January the 17th. Now, it heats up by January the 18th. They're asking for a motion to clear the case with the police department. There's an offer of the city council to clear this case and get going. And Art Snyder of the city council announced for the record once more repeating that the vast majority of the LAPD are innocent of wrongdoing. Now, the council approved 10-1 a motion that it's not to make it a crime that anybody at any city council meetings be prosecuted if he returns or leaks what kind of deals they're making. And Daryl Gates, the chief of police, refuses to have a commission monitor them, and he refuses to have a judge monitor them. The police commission are responsible for investigating them after they commit crimes or do burglaries or rapes or hire murderers. The police commission comes in. But the police commission is not to come in before the crime is committed. Okay, this is going back and forth from January the 18th, from the time Ducote surfaced, January the 7th, and those papers were in the file, and I told you that already there was talk in the pretrial depositions of the links of the Los Angeles police to Donald DeFreeze, and this would open the LAPD and the Alfred Bloomingdale story, and even it could go into the key of some of the people into the Manson family or even Dennis Wilson, because Sheriff Peter Pitches and LAPD were behind that whole ball of wax. So by January the 18th, they decided they would have a stalemate and wait. They hadn't decided what to do. On January the 19th, William French Smith says to Ronald Reagan, "I'm going to California." Now, he didn't tell anybody till the weekend, but by Wednesday, he was getting his shoes packed and coming to California as fast as he could. And Edwin Meese was to become the Attorney General. Now, they didn't decide that until Saturday night or Sunday. I guess it was Sunday while everyone was watching the football game, and the controversy, it's not a controversy, the suspense of William French Smith leaving as Attorney General just at the time, just before the president announces that he's going to run for re-election. William French Smith says, "Oh, I have to go home and run the campaign. I've been behind him since 1966, and I have to help him now." He was behind him in 66 when Von Damme came. He was behind him in 67 when Ducote was hired by Bloomingdale. He was behind him when the sadomasochism sex parties of politicians was going on down there. He was behind him when they planned to kill Cesar Chavez and brought in the Teamsters, and is an attorney for the agriculture business to break the labor unions with the field workers in California. He was behind him with all of the People's Park. Edwin Meese was literally the guy that gave the order to shoot, to have the People's Park incident. He was behind him behind the Isla Vista with Sheriff Peter Pitches and the LAPD counterintelligence for riots in Santa Barbara and the Bank of America to make it look like the youth and the hippie did it. He was behind him with the San Quentin Six, the killing of George Jackson and the terrorism, breaking the prisons and bringing in drugs and goon squads and hit teams dressed as prisoners. Louis Tackwood did that for the LAPD, and they were setting up provocateur things between the blacks to get them in forever or kill people like George Jackson, to arrest Angela Davis, to set up the shootout in Marin County. He was behind him for that. He was behind him with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and the assassination teams that helped off John Kennedy via the network of the CIA and the Galen organization, going back to those early hit teams that they can pull on. Now, William French Smith, on January the 19th, tells Ronnie he doesn't even wait till Thursday. He has to get post haste out to his law office because he says he has to help the president get elected. Elected to what? Here are publications that Larry Flint's had about Edwin Meese, and I hope you copy those articles about Edwin Meese out of Rebel magazine, and if it's off the stand and you can't get it, I understand there was one issue of Rebel between Rebel 3 that I never got. I'll have to get it from somebody. It never came to my home. I've gotten 3 copies, but there's more out, and I missed one that Don Freed told me about Vicki Morgan. If they just scratch Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese and the appointment for him as Attorney General and go in, this is your last chance to get Ronald Reagan. Edwin Meese ran these bloodbaths, and when he ran for president, I couldn't figure why people were sitting on their butts. Copy those articles about Edwin Meese and Jerry Ducote out of the... I have reprints of The Hustler. If you didn't buy it, I'll send you a copy, and you send the cost for printing. It's like 3 or 4 pages, and the postage stamp, and then you have copies made just like this friend did in Texas, 120 copies out. Why don't you bombard the news media and the people? Teach your Congressman Panetta what Western Gold is and Edwin Meese. Is Edwin Meese on those sex tapes? Now it's important to protect Larry Flynt, really Larry Flynt, because he's the only person, forget the guys that came in and literally took over that place and what happened to him, forget that. He's the only person who had pictures of Edwin Meese, the accessory before this came down, who has literally, I think, forced this case to be stalemated. Now, the Civil Liberties Union is not into all of the activity, but they know the Jerry Ducote connections to Ronald Reagan. They know full well where the next stage goes. They've been working on this 5 years. I certainly can't believe that one single plaintiff who was robbed and burglarized, blacklisted, and whose name went into a computer that goes to Western goes to Larry McDonald. I can't believe that one single plaintiff who went through all they did through the anti-war years and through all those years of turmoil could possibly accept a settlement on this case, with the condition that the police department said, we're too busy. The January 19th, the day that William French Smith told Ronald Reagan he's coming over to help him get reelected, on that day the LA Times had an article, the city council insisted the trial would cost millions with no guarantee of winning. With no guarantee of winning. Which would you give them the choice? To have them declare that everybody was exemplary and wonderful, no guarantee of winning, and it would sidetrack the police department at a crucial time before the Olympic Games. A crucial time, you may get a coup. The Blue Thunder is ready to roll. You better believe it's a crucial time. Los Angeles Times, January 19th. The city council insisted the trial would have cost millions with no guarantee of winning. They certainly want it on their own terms, and are they desperate? And if those plaintiffs don't accept that bargain, with no guarantee of winning, we'll give you $1.5 million, and $700,000 or $800,000 will go to your attorney. Subtract that off the top, and then 131 organizations of plaintiffs are supposed to get the crumbs, with no guarantee of winning. The police wants to sell this, and they also want no watchdog, which they agreed to do when the settlement began. Nobody to watch us. And then it said Mayor Tom Bradley favored a settlement, which I said before, and they said that they're afraid they'll distract the police at a crucial time, as I said, before the Olympic Games. This may be the only chance if they try to pull this with the Olympics with the provocateurs. Now, when I wrote Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, that was written in the summer of '72 because the Squad 19, the same LAPD, was planning to kill Richard Nixon, make Agnew president and have the riots, but the convention was moved from San Diego to Miami, so it gave a little extra time and exposure of funding and necessity for them to plant documents in the Democratic headquarters, so when the riots took place, the Democrats would be blamed for the violence. Now, that Squad 19 was working then with E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and James McCord and the Pentagon, and it was put off. This is 12 years later. That team hasn't fallen apart. The only body who's fallen apart are the liberals. That team is strong. Ed Davis is a senator in California, and now the Olympic Games is coming up, and they are arming to the teeth. The Defense Department, if they dropped a bomb, you wouldn't be able to prove it was their provocateur, but any placement of agents like Richard Nixon had a church for Frank Sturgis, that tobacco, alcohol, and firearms, the IRS, gave him, all of a sudden Frank Sturgis was a priest down in Florida with a stockpile of weapons going. So what happened, I believe, with the swiftness of William French Smith, he didn't wait till Reagan announced why he was going to be president. Post haste, there's a stalemate until the end of the month. The trial is actually beginning down there, unless I didn't see today's LA Times. You wouldn't know it from any other paper of what's going on. The trial for all purposes is still unfolding, and they have to have, the ACLU can't make the agreement with the plaintiffs, so they have to agree between each other if they're going to settle for that. And why would you settle for a case that exonerates all the policemen, no watch guard to watch them, and they think they may lose the case, and they're such chickens that they reneged on the original bargains or considerations, and they want to clear out because they may lose. If I was a plaintiff, I would go all the way. 131 of them can't be gunned down at one time by Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan. And I certainly think and hope they go all the way. And if they don't, this will be the most massive cover-up of news media, never hitting a wire service, the AP, the UPI, for an entire year where the pre-trial depositions were being taken, A 5-year trial that can be over because the city council says they're innocent, they're not guilty, they're exemplary. That is the Los Angeles Police Department. That's Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan. And this is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU-FM. I'll be back with you next week. Some more on those rats. Goodbye.